Hi there, folks. So we are back for the first of this week's reading lectures. So as always, we're going to have a number of reading questions, right? So those are already been posted on the Discord and in the Blackboard page. In addition to that, we also have a little bit of supplemental lecture, try and give some idea of some extra stuff that's going on in these readings, and we'll have questions posted for those. If you are wondering about the due dates and there's some concern over that, essentially all the stuff we're posting here on Monday and Tuesday, that stuff is all due on Friday. And stuff we're doing on Friday, that's mostly a follow-up to our Slate Political Gabfest discussion. Those are due next Tuesday. So if it gets out Monday and Tuesday, then it's due on Friday. If it comes out Friday, it's due on Tuesday. So pretty simple. So I want to talk today about gun ownership and gun culture. And the idea in the article is really about a guy who is part of gun culture, who is talking about guns and how he's really does a lot to establish his bona fides that he is in fact a real member of gun culture, that he has always owned a gun, that he hunts a lot, that he shoots a lot. And we're going to have that go along with his concern with the way gun culture has changed. So the argument he makes is that when he was young, gun culture, when he came into gun culture, it was much more about the sort of rural country life, that is people were hunting and shooting and using that as a way to supplement their income, essentially. So hunting was much more like fishing, right? That it wasn't something you did because it was fun or was a sport, even if it was, but rather because you did it in order to get fish so you could have something to eat. And he talks about how people would hand down guns from generation to generation, and that becomes a part of their identity. And I think he's also opened himself up to the fact that even though his father, he says, was never really that into guns, he became into it, and he began to be partially because of trauma he suffered as a teenager when he was robbed at gunpoint, and talks about the various times where police or criminals have held guns to his head, which perhaps makes him more worried about having a gun on his person at all times. But I want to talk, that's all in the article. What I want to talk about here, though, is this idea of gun ownership as a social identity. So I want to introduce you to the idea of social identity theory. All right. So the idea of social identity theory is that everybody has lots of social identities. And you don't have just one, you have a number. And so these are going to be things like your political identity, right? So you might be a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian. They might be things like your racial identity, right? Because there's African American or white or Asian American or Chinese, or whatever your ethnic identity or racial identity might be. It could also be things like sexual identity. You're straight or you're gay or you're trans or you're bi or whatever, if you're a member of a sexual orientation, gender identity minority group. So all of these are different social identities, and they're all to some extent constructed. And because they're constructed, right? You may say, well, I am African American. That's true. But the social identity is the extent to which you feel a kinship with other African Americans, and that you feel your African American identity, your racial identity, is relevant to whatever decisions you're making right now. So different social identities are often going to push us different directions. So it could be that you're a Democrat, but you also have a social identity as a white person. And so policies that might hurt white people but are favored by Democrats might push you different ways. So as a Democrat, I'm against it, but as a white person, I'm for it. So how do we resolve these conflicts between different identities? Well, it depends on which identity is salient at that moment. So salient simply means whichever one you're thinking about most, whichever one is most relevant to decision making. So some social identities are relevant much of the time. So gender or sex is relevant a lot. So the fact in almost any social situation you're in, the question of whether you're a man or a woman is going to change the way you respond to the environment around you. Similarly, different identities are going to matter depending on whether they are relevant in that moment. So your racial identity, often, if you're in a community where you're part of the dominant racial group, so you're African American, everyone in your community is African American, you don't see a lot of people who aren't African American, well, then your racial identity isn't necessarily going to be very salient when you're in your community, because that's the way everyone is. So it almost doesn't matter there. So other identities, your religious identity, your political identity, your gender identity might be more important. But if you go into an area where you are very much a minority in your racial identity, so if you are the only African American person in a group of white people, then suddenly your racial identity becomes more important. And this is true for any of these social identities. So you might have a strong identity as a Catholic, but your identity as a Catholic is going to matter most when you're in a religious context or when you're with other people who don't share religion or other people who do share religion. So the different social identities are going to have different valences, are going to be differentially important depending on what environment you're in and what the social grouping you're in is. Now, how does gun ownership play into this? Well, what the author, Joy, is arguing here is that gun ownership didn't necessarily used to really be part of a social identity. That is, it was something you did, but it wasn't something you thought about a lot or adhered to, and perhaps because everyone in the area was doing it, but it wasn't part of who you were. It was just something you did. And the change has been that now gun ownership has become part of a strong social identity for many gun owners. That is, they see gun ownership as part of who they are. And so we say, well, people don't need to own certain guns or shouldn't own guns at all. They see that as an attack not just on something they do, but as an attack on who they are as a person. It's like if someone makes an attack against white people and you're a white person, you might take that personally. And so if gun ownership is a social identity, any attack against gun ownership in general, even if you don't use an assault rifle, if people talk about, oh, people who own assault rifles are irresponsible, you say, oh, you're saying something bad about my group. And that makes it very difficult to have a real debate about these things. So gun owners also believe, as part of this social identity, that there's something of an exceptional group. They're taking on additional responsibility in society. And we see this in the oft-heard refrain that the only solution to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. The idea that anyone who's carrying around a concealed weapon, carrying around a weapon on their person all times, well, they're saying, well, I'm doing this in order to protect others. That if for any reason somebody else starts shooting, there's a mass shooting right now, which again, basically never happens, but I'm going to be the one who stands up and protects other people. So they see themselves as taking on additional responsibility. And that is part of the social identity, that they're taking on additional responsibility that makes them that makes them better people, better citizens than others. And so when we have an attack against gun ownership, saying, well, these gun owners, guns are killing a lot of people, they go, whoa, 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 we're actually helping you. We're trying to save you and you're attacking us. That's not right. Now you're saying to yourself, how do you square this idea that gun owners are responsible, that see themselves as being extra responsible and taking on extra burdens in society? How do you square that with the fact that there's lots of mass shootings in the United States, more mass shootings in the United States than anywhere else in the world? Well, the way they square it is by some version of the no true Scotsman argument. No true Scotsman argument is a logical fallacy. It says, well, no true Scotsman would do this. You say, well, but that Scotsman did that. You go, well, that means he wasn't true. So all real gun owners, all true gun owners are responsible, law-abiding people. We go, but this guy shot a bunch of people. He's not responsible, law-abiding. Well, he wasn't a true gun owner then. He wasn't a real member of our group. So there are no bad members of the group once we apply the no true Scotsman argument. It's a fallacy because it says, well, if you don't do what I say the group does, then you aren't part of the group to begin with. So we're excluding people from the group after the fact. So they're saying gun ownership doesn't need to be limited because of the acts of mass shooters, because they're saying, well, that's punishing gun owners, when indeed, responsible gun owners never actually carry out mass shootings, because if they did carry out mass shootings, they wouldn't be responsible gun owners. Now, the fact that many gun owners see gun ownership as a social identity means that debates over gun ownership in the United States largely don't go anywhere, because the two sides are talking past each other. So you have the people in favor of gun restrictions on gun ownership, and they're going to say things like, why does anyone need to own an assault rifle? Assault rifles are made for killing people. That's all they're for. So you have no need for it, right? If you need to protect yourself, get a handgun. If you need to hunt, get a rifle. There's no reason to have an assault rifle like an AR-15 at all. And so the other side is going to say, well, they not hear this as these guns are bad. They hear it as your social identity is bad. There's something wrong with you. You want to own these guns, and these guns are bad. Therefore, you are bad. And they say, look, it's part of my culture. It's part of my identity to own guns, and you just don't understand. More importantly, you're denigrating us gun owners, when in reality, us gun owners are more responsible than other people. We're taking on additional jobs in society, protecting everybody else, and now you're saying we're responsible and we're bad. So this leads to a standoff, and the standoff is exacerbated by a federal system. Federal system meaning we have a division of lawmaking between national level and subnational levels, in this case, the states. So the states can have very different gun laws than the national level. And in fact, the national level doesn't do very much on gun restrictions. This is left up to the states. And so in areas where there are lots of gun owners, state laws are going to be very protective of gun ownership and foster that sort of gun culture. Now, the last thing I'll talk about here, social identity, is the consequences of this. The consequence of the fact that we don't have a real debate about gun ownership. and about guns in the United States. We don't have that debate because it really is a debate. The arguments we have are about social identity versus mass shootings. And the consequence of that is that unlike any other country in the world, we have a large number of mass shootings because people see it as their social identity, see it as important to them, not as something they have, but as something they are. We don't adequately restrict people's access to guns because any restriction on guns is seen as an attack on gun owners rather than on gun ownership. So we want to pass a law like, for instance, saying that people who have been adjudicated mentally insane can't have a gun. Now that seems like a relatively low bar. I want you to think about how crazy your roommates are, right? They're pretty nuts, right? But your roommates are crazy, but they have not been adjudicated mentally insane by a judge where a judge goes, you are so crazy. You cannot sign paperwork. You can't do anything. No. So think of how crazy your roommates are. Think of how much crazier than that you would have to be for a judge to go, you crazy. So if we try and pass a law saying those people who've been adjudicated mentally insane, who cannot open a credit card account, who can't sign a contract, that they can't own a gun, well, that seems pretty basic, right? If you are that crazy, no, you shouldn't be allowed to own a gun. You've got mental illness. We need to get that taken care of. But why can't you pass a law like that? Because gun owners are going to perceive that as an attack on them. Saying, oh, you're saying gun ownership today. You're trying to restrict gun ownership. For them, it's an all or nothing categorization, right? There is gun freedom or there's not. You can't say there's just a little bit of gun freedom, the freedom to own guns. It's all or nothing. And any attack on any part of it is an attack on all of it. So because of this, we have very, depending on the state, we have very lax restrictions on guns. Now, some states, like here in New Jersey, gun ownership is pretty heavily restricted. We're what's called a may issue state. So essentially, if you want to get a gun, you're going to go to your local sheriff's office or the city police, and you're going to ask them for a gun permit. They say, why do you need that? And you're going to explain why you think you need the gun. And the police are likely going to say, no, don't think you actually need it. And you're done, right? If you want a hunting rifle, maybe they'll give you a permit for a hunting rifle if you say you want to go hunting. But honestly, they're probably not going to give you your gun permit. Other states are what's called a shall issue state. And shall issue states simply mean that you go and you apply for the gun permit and they're going to give it to you unless there's a good reason not to, right? So in the may issue state like New Jersey, they give you the gun, they don't give you the gun permit unless there's a good reason. In other states, like North Carolina is the one they bring up in the article, it's a shall issue state where they're going to give it to you unless there's a good reason why you shouldn't get the gun permit. That means a lot of people who probably shouldn't get guns are going to get them because it's relatively easy to get them. And there are people who have a history of mental illness. And if you're mentally ill and you're angry at someone, you might very well use that gun to shoot individuals or shoot groups of people. So what can be done about this? Because, again, any attack on gun ownership, anyone saying, look, we need to restrict gun ownership in order to get rid of these bad apples, they're going to perceive it as an attack, not just on gun ownership, but on gun owners. Saying you're bad, you're not responsible. And of course, gun owners see that as fallacious because they would say, look, no responsible gun owner actually cares about mass shootings. In fact, we're protecting you from mass shootings. Now, is it possible to fix this problem? The answer is, of course it is. We are the only country in the world where these sort of mass shootings happen. Other countries that have similar cultures, so Australia, for instance, has similar sort of frontier cultures we do, where people traditionally had guns to protect themselves when they didn't feel they could trust the police because the police were too far away. Australia, as you might know, is a very, very large country, and a lot of it is basically empty. So Australia, after a mass shooting in the 1990s, passed very strict gun control laws. And as a result, they haven't had a mass shooting since. Other countries have occasionally mass stabbings, where someone will take a knife and stab 10 people. But being stabbed and being shot are, of course, two very, very different things. And while stabbing is bad, it's not nearly as bad as being shot. And of course, if someone just got a knife, 5 or 6 people can certainly take that person down. There's no way you're going to have a mass stabbing where someone's able to kill 30 or 40 or 50 people. It just doesn't work that way. So are there things that can be done? The answer is yes. There's a particular brand of American exceptionalism where we say America is the greatest country in the world, but we can't solve these problems, right? These problems always happen to us and there's nothing we can do about it. You'll see this with things like universal health care. Other countries give universal health care, but we can't. Or mass shootings. Other countries solve this, but we can't. And I simply don't believe that. Of course, with political will, we could solve the problem of mass shootings. The problem is that there are not as many politicians as you would need to actually fix the problem. And the reason is because the people who believe in gun ownership believe strongly this part of their cultural identity. Now, this actually feeds into the meritocracy book we've been reading as well. because the people that are in the gun-heavy areas are also people that have been largely left behind by the transition in our economy and our society. And so they're already feeling attacked. They're already feeling like these elites are talking down to them. And so when you talk about gun restrictions on guns, they see it as, oh, it's these elites, these people from outside of our area who aren't part of our culture, telling us how to live, telling us what to do. And of course, they're going to take that personally, right? That these are people they say just don't understand my culture, just don't understand what I'm trying to do. And they see it as an attack on their culture rather than attempt to try and fix the underlying problems. All right, that's enough right now. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again very shortly.